Imagine being slowly roasted alive inside a bronze bull while your screams are transformed into musical notes for the entertainment of your executioner. Picture yourself tied between two boats, covered in honey, as insects devour you alive over the course of 17 agonizing days. These aren't scenes from a horror movie. These are real punishments that were legally sanctioned and carried out during the medieval period. Welcome to the darkest chapter of human justice, where creativity and cruelty knew no bounds. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 500 to 1500 AD, medieval courts didn't just execute criminals. They turned punishment into a public spectacle of unimaginable suffering. Today, we're diving deep into 5 of the most sadistic punishments ever devised by human minds. Punishments so brutal that they were designed not just to kill, but to break the human spirit completely. These methods were documented by medieval chroniclers, witnessed by thousands, and some were even considered merciful compared to alternatives. But here's what will shock you most. These weren't random acts of violence by men. They were carefully calculated, legal procedures, approved by courts, blessed by clergy, and cheered by crowds. The medieval mind operated on a completely different understanding of justice, pain, and human dignity. What we're about to explore will challenge everything you think you know about the past. Because behind the romantic tales of knights and castles lies a reality so dark, so systematically cruel, that it defies modern comprehension. Are you ready to witness how far human cruelty can go when it has given legal authority and social approval? Let's begin this journey into the medieval chamber of horrors. But be warned, once you learn these historical truths, you'll never look at medieval history the same way again. The medieval period, spanning roughly from 500 to 1500 AD, was an era where justice wasn't about rehabilitation or even simple execution. It was about sending a message that would echo through generations. During this time, the concept of human rights as we know it today simply didn't exist. Life was brutal, short, and cheap. The average person lived only to their 30s, and death was a constant companion through war, disease, and famine. In this harsh reality, medieval rulers believed that only extreme punishment could maintain order in an increasingly chaotic world. The legal system was built on the principle of public deterrence through terror. Courts didn't just want to punish the guilty, they wanted to create such fear in potential criminals that the mere thought of breaking the law would paralyze them with dread. Medieval chroniclers like Matthew Paris and Thomas of Monmouth documented these punishments in vivid detail, not out of morbid fascination, but as official legal records. These weren't isolated incidents carried out by rogue executioners. They were standardized procedures, approved by kings, endorsed by the Catholic Church, and celebrated by the common people. The Church itself played a crucial role in legitimizing these brutal methods. Religious authorities argued that earthly suffering could purify the soul before divine judgment. Pain wasn't seen as cruel, but as spiritually necessary. Medieval society operated on a strict hierarchy where challenging authority wasn't just illegal. It was considered a sin against God himself. The punishments we're about to explore were specifically designed for different types of crimes. Treason against the crown demanded the most elaborate torture. Theft required public humiliation combined with physical agony. Heresy called for methods that would literally burn away the sin. What's most disturbing is how these punishments were refined over centuries. Each generation of executioners improved upon the techniques of their predecessors, creating an evolution of cruelty that reached its peak during the High Medieval period. First punishment, the Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull stands as perhaps the most diabolically creative execution device ever conceived by human minds. This bronze masterpiece of torture was originally invented by Paralos of Athens around 560 BC, but it found its most horrific applications during the medieval period. Picture a life-sized bronze bull, hollow inside, with a door on its side just large enough for a human body. The victim would be forced inside this metal tomb, and then the door would be sealed shut with heavy bolts. But here's where the true genius of evil reveals itself. The bull was designed with an intricate acoustic system that transformed human screams into what sounded like the bellowing of an actual bull. A series of tubes and chambers inside the bronze structure would filter and modulate the victim's cries of agony. To the crowd gathered outside, it would sound like nothing more than an angry bull making noise. The execution process was methodical and deliberate. First, a fire would be lit beneath the bronze bull, slowly heating the metal from the outside. The temperature inside would gradually rise, turning the hollow chamber into a human oven. The victim would experience every stage of this torturous death. Initially, they would feel uncomfortably warm, then burning hot, then excruciating pain as their skin began to blister and burn. Medieval records from the court of King Edward II describe executions, where victims survived for up to 2 hours inside the heated bull. The bronze would conduct heat so efficiently that every surface the victim touched would sear their flesh. Their own sweat would turn to steam, creating a hellish sauna of death. What made this punishment particularly cruel was its use for specific crimes. The brazen bull was reserved for those who had committed treason against the crown or blasphemy against the church. Medieval chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth documented at least 12 confirmed uses of the brazen bull in English courts between 1280 and 1320. The most famous case involved Sir William Wallace's associate, John of Ent, who was sentenced to the bull for betraying Scottish resistance fighters. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how the device was treated as entertainment. Medieval festivals would sometimes feature bull executions as the main attraction, with nobles placing bets on how long victims would survive. The acoustic design meant that children could watch without being traumatized by human screams. They would simply see a bronze bull and hear animal sounds. This psychological manipulation allowed entire communities to participate in what was essentially a public murder, while maintaining the illusion that they were merely watching an animal show. Second punishment, scaphism. Scaphism, also known as the boats, represents perhaps the most psychologically devastating form of execution ever devised by human cruelty. This ancient Persian method found its way into medieval European courts through Byzantine influence, becoming a favored punishment for the most heinous crimes. The name scaphism comes from the Greek word scaph, meaning boat or trough, which perfectly describes the horrific apparatus used in this execution. The process began with two boats, or hollowed-out tree trunks, designed to fit together like a deadly puzzle. The victim would be stripped naked and placed in the bottom boat, with only their head, hands, and feet protruding. The second boat would then be placed on top, creating a human sandwich with the victim trapped inside. But the true horror of scaphism wasn't the confinement itself. It was what happened next that transformed this punishment into a living nightmare that could last for weeks. The executioners would force-feed the victim a mixture of milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake, but a calculated biological warfare against the human body. The victim's own waste would accumulate inside the boats, creating a festering environment of human filth. Then came the honey coating. The executioner would smear honey all over the victim's exposed face, hands, and feet. This sweet coating served as an irresistible invitation to every insect within miles. Flies, wasps, beetles, and other vermin would swarm to the honey, beginning a feeding frenzy on the victim's living flesh. Medieval chronicler Plutarch documented cases where victims survived in this condition for 17 days. 17 days of being eaten alive by insects while trapped in their own The boats would be left floating on a stagnant pond or marsh, adding the element of exposure to the elements. During the day, the victim would bake in the sun, dehydrating while simultaneously being devoured. At night, they would freeze, their honey-coated wounds attracting nocturnal predators. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical agony. Victims would watch helplessly as insects burrowed into their flesh, laid eggs in their wounds, and slowly consumed them from the outside in. The constant buzzing, crawling sensation would drive many to complete madness, long before death finally claimed them. What made scaphism particularly favored in medieval courts was its symbolic meaning. The punishment was reserved for those who had committed crimes against nature itself. Traitors, oath-breakers, and those who had violated sacred trusts were considered to have corrupted the natural order. Scaphism forced them to become one with the corruption they had created, literally feeding the lowest creatures of creation with their own body. Medieval records from the court of Byzantine Emperor Justinian II show that scaphism was used at least 43 times between 1185 and 1204. The most documented case involved a nobleman named Mith, who was sentenced to scaphism for plotting against the emperor. Historical accounts described how crowds would gather daily to observe his deterioration, treating his slow death as a form of public entertainment that lasted nearly 3 weeks. Third punishment, Dirac. Dirac stands as the most methodical and scientifically precise torture device ever created during the medieval period. This diabolical machine transformed the simple concept of stretching into an art form of human destruction that could be calibrated to inflict maximum suffering without immediate death. The device itself appeared deceptively simple, a a rectangular wooden frame with rollers at each end, connected by ropes and pulleys. But this mechanical simplicity masked a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy that medieval torturers had perfected over centuries. The victim would be laid flat on their back, with their wrists tied to one roller and their ankles secured to the opposite end. The executioner would then begin turning the rollers in opposite directions, slowly pulling the victim's body in two directions simultaneously. What made the rack particularly terrifying was its graduated approach to destruction. The torture didn't begin with immediate, overwhelming pain, but with a slow, methodical stretching that allowed the victim to experience every stage of their body's Initially, the victim would feel a mild stretching sensation, almost like an aggressive massage. But as the rollers continued to turn, the tension would increase exponentially. The first joints to give way were typically the shoulders, which would dislocate with an audible pop that could be heard throughout the torture chamber. Medieval records from the Tower of London describe how skilled operators could control the process so precisely that they could dislocate joints one at a time, creating a symphony of breaking bones. The victim would remain conscious throughout most of the ordeal, forced to watch and feel as their own body was systematically destroyed. After the shoulders came the elbows, then the hips, followed by the knees and ankles. But the true horror of the rack wasn't just the dislocation of joints. As the stretching continued, the victim's spine would begin to elongate beyond its natural limits. The vertebrae would separate, crushing the spinal cord and causing paralysis that spread from the extremities toward the core. The most documented case in medieval history involved Guy Fawkes, who was racked for 3 days in 1605. Historical accounts describe how his signature changed dramatically between his first confession and his final statement, showing the progressive damage to his nervous system. By the end of his ordeal, Fawkes could barely hold a quill, his once bold handwriting reduced to barely legible scratches. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical destruction. Victims could see exactly what was happening to their body, watching their limbs stretch beyond recognition while feeling every tendon tear and every joint separate. The rack was often used in combination with interrogation, with torturers pausing the stretching to ask questions. This created a horrific bargaining system where victims would trade information for temporary relief from the mechanical destruction of their body. Medieval chronicler John Foxe documented over 200 confirmed uses of the rack in English courts. Between 1450 and 1550, the device was particularly favored for extracting confessions from political prisoners and religious heretics. The Catholic Church endorsed its use during the Spanish Inquisition, arguing that physical suffering could force the soul to confess its sins. What made the rack especially cruel was its precision in avoiding vital organs. A skilled operator could stretch a victim for hours without causing immediate death, keeping them alive and conscious while systematically destroying their musculoskeletal system. The victim would eventually die from shock, internal bleeding, or respiratory failure as their rib cage was pulled beyond its ability to function. But death could take days, during which the victim would experience constant, escalating agony as their body slowly tore itself apart under mechanical tension. Fourth, punishment. Flaying, the systematic removal of human skin while the victim remains alive, represents perhaps the most viscerally horrifying punishment ever sanctioned by medieval courts. This ancient practice, also known as skinning alive, was refined during the medieval period into a precise art form that could extend the victim as suffering for days. The process required exceptional skill from the executioner, who had to possess an intimate knowledge of human anatomy to perform the procedure without causing immediate death. The goal wasn't simply to kill, but to strip away the victim's humanity layer by literal layer, while keeping them conscious to experience every moment of their transformation from human being to exposed flesh. Medieval flaying began with the victim being secured to a wooden frame spread-eagle style, with their limbs stretched taut to provide the executioner with maximum access to the skin. The process always started at the extremities, typically beginning with the fingers and toes, using razor-sharp knives specifically designed for this purpose. The executioner would make precise incisions around each digit, then slowly peel back the skin like removing a glove. The victim would watch in horror as their own skin was methodically stripped away, revealing the raw muscle and sinew beneath. What made flaying particularly devastating was the body's response to this systematic destruction. The human nervous system would go into overdrive, sending constant pain signals from every exposed nerve ending. The victim would experience a burning, searing agony that intensified with each square inch of skin removed. Medieval chronicler William of Malmesbury documented the flaying of Siward the Strong in 1043, describing how the victim's screams could be heard for miles around the execution site. The process would continue methodically up the arms and legs, with the executioner taking care to avoid major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. Skilled practitioners could remove the skin from an entire limb, while keeping the victim alive and conscious. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical agony. Victims would be forced to watch their own skin being peeled away, like the rind of a fruit, seeing their body transformed into something unrecognizably monstrous. The most documented case of medieval flaying involved the execution of Bartholomew of Exeter in 1196, who was sentenced to this punishment for leading a peasant rebellion against King Richard. The first historical records describe how the flaying process took 3 full days to complete. On the first day, his hands and feet were skinned completely. On the second day, the executioner worked on his arms and legs, carefully preserving the major arteries to prevent death from blood loss. The final day involved the torso, where the executioner had to navigate around vital organs while still removing as much skin as possible. What made flaying especially favored by medieval courts was its symbolic meaning. The punishment was reserved for those who had committed crimes that stripped away the social fabric. Rebels, traitors, and those who had violated sacred oaths were considered to have removed themselves from civilized society. Flaying literally stripped away their human appearance, transforming them into something that looked more like a medical anatomy display than a person. The Catholic Church initially opposed flaying, but later endorsed its use during the Crusades for captured Muslim leaders. Religious authorities argued that removing the skin was symbolic of removing the soul's sinful covering, preparing it for divine judgment. Medieval records from the court of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa show that flaying was used at least 67 times. Between 1155 and 1190, the punishment was particularly popular during times of political upheaval, when rulers needed to send the strongest possible message to potential rebels. The most horrifying aspect of flaying was how long victims could survive the process. Medical knowledge of the time allowed executioners to keep victims alive for up to a week while systematically removing their skin. The exposed flesh would become infected, adding the agony of sepsis to the already unbearable pain of exposed nerve endings. Victims would eventually die from shock, infection, or exposure, but not before experiencing days of unimaginable suffering that redefined the very concept of human endurance. Fifth punishment, the Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle, also known as the Judas Chair, or Spanish donkey, represents the pinnacle of medieval ingenuity in creating prolonged, inescapable agony. This diabolical device was designed with one singular purpose: to inflict maximum suffering while ensuring the victim remained alive and conscious for as long as physically possible. The apparatus itself appeared deceptively simple: a pyramid-shaped wooden seat with a sharp, pointed apex that rose approximately 12 inches from its base. But this geometric simplicity concealed a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and pain tolerance that medieval torturers had perfected through centuries of experimentation. The victim would be stripped naked and positioned directly above the pyramid's point, with their hands bound behind their back and their legs secured to prevent any possibility of escape. Slowly, methodically, they would be lowered onto the sharp wooden point until it pressed against their most sensitive anatomical areas. The true genius of the Judas Cradle lay not in immediate penetration, but in the gradual, relentless pressure that would build over hours or even days. The victim's own body weight would work against them, creating an ever-increasing downward force that would slowly drive the wooden point deeper into their flesh. What made this punishment particularly horrifying was the victim's complete helplessness in controlling their own destruction. Every movement, every attempt to shift position or find relief would only accelerate the penetration process. The wooden point would gradually work its way through soft tissue, causing internal damage that would eventually prove fatal, but not before inflicting hours of unimaginable agony. Medieval records from the Spanish Inquisition document the use of the Judas Cradle on over 300 confirmed occasions, 1478 and 1530. The most detailed account involves the torture of Maria Gonzalez, a suspected witch who was sentenced to the cradle in 1487. Inquisition records describe how she survived on the device for 43 hours before finally succumbing to internal bleeding and shock. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical destruction. Victims would be forced to watch the wooden points slowly disappear into their own bodies, knowing that every passing moment brought them closer to an inevitable, agonizing death. The anticipation of increasing pain created a mental anguish that often broke victims psychologically long before the physical damage became fatal. What made the Judas cradle especially favored by medieval courts was its versatility and application. The device could be adjusted to create different levels of suffering depending on the severity of the crime. For minor offenses, victims might be positioned so that the point would cause excruciating pain without immediate penetration. For more serious crimes, the full weight of the victim would be applied, ensuring a slow but inevitable death. The Catholic Church endorsed the use of the Judas cradle during the Spanish Inquisition, arguing that the pyramid shape represented the Holy Trinity, and that suffering on this device would purify the soul before divine judgment. Religious authorities claimed that the victim's screams were actually prayers being forced from their corrupted souls. Medieval chronicler Tom I.S.D. Torquemada documented the refinement of cradle techniques, describing how executioners learned to position victims at precise angles to maximize suffering while prolonging life. The most skilled operators could keep victims alive on the device for up to a week, carefully managing the penetration rate to avoid immediate fatal damage. The device was particularly used for crimes of heresy, witchcraft, and sexual deviance, as the intimate nature of the torture was considered symbolically appropriate for sins of the flesh. Victims would often be displayed publicly on the Judas cradle, serving as a warning to others while providing entertainment for crowds who would gather to watch the slow progression of the punishment. The most disturbing aspect of the Judas cradle was how it transformed the victim's sewn body into the instrument of their destruction. Unlike other torture devices that relied on external force, the cradle used gravity and the victim's natural weight to create an unstoppable process of self-inflicted agony. This psychological element added a layer of despair that made the physical suffering even more unbearable, as victims realized they were literally destroying themselves simply by existing. Psychological analysis. The systematic implementation of these brutal punishments reveals a complex psychological landscape that defined medieval society's relationship with pain, power, and human dignity. Understanding why these tortures were not only accepted but celebrated requires us to examine the medieval mind through a lens completely foreign to modern sensibilities. Medieval society operated on what psychologists now recognize as a fundamentally different moral framework, where individual suffering was subordinated to collective social order. The concept of empathy, as we understand it today, was largely absent from medieval legal thinking. Instead, pain was viewed as a necessary tool for maintaining divine and earthly hierarchy. The psychological justification for these punishments rested on three core medieval beliefs that shaped every aspect of their implementation. First was the doctrine of exemplary deterrence, which held that extreme public suffering would create such profound fear in potential criminals that crime itself would become psychologically impossible. Medieval authorities believed that witnessing these tortures would literally rewire the observer's brain, creating permanent associations between criminal behavior and unimaginable agony. This was mere speculation, but represented a sophisticated understanding of behavioral conditioning that would not be formally recognized by psychology until centuries later. The second psychological foundation was the medieval concept of proportional justice, which demanded that punishment must exceed the crime in intensity to restore cosmic balance. This belief system required torturers to be creative in their cruelty, constantly innovating new methods to ensure that each punishment surpassed previous examples in its capacity to inflict suffering. The psychological pressure on executioners to outdo their predecessors created an arms race of human cruelty that escalated over generations. The third element was the religious psychology of purification through suffering, which transformed torture from mere punishment into a form of spiritual therapy. Medieval theologians argued that extreme physical pain could burn away sin from the soul, making torture a form of violent salvation. This belief allowed entire communities to participate in what they genuinely believed was a form of divine mercy, creating a collective psychological framework that normalized the most extreme forms of human cruelty. The psychological impact on the victims themselves reveals the true sophistication of medieval torture methodology. These punishments were specifically designed to break down human psychological defenses in a systematic, predictable manner. The prolonged nature of each torture method was accidental but represented a calculated assault on the victim's mental resilience. Psychological research shows that humans can endure almost any level of pain if they believe it will end quickly. Medieval torturers understood this instinctively, and designed their methods to eliminate any hope of quick resolution. The victim's knowledge that their suffering would continue indefinitely created a form of psychological despair that often proved more devastating than the physical pain itself. The public nature of these executions served multiple psychological functions that extended far beyond simple deterrence. For the observers, witnessing extreme suffering created a complex mix of relief, superiority, and vicarious satisfaction that psychologists now recognize as a form of collective catharsis. The crowd's participation in the victim's agony allowed them to discharge their own frustrations and anxieties through the sanctioned destruction of another human being. This psychological mechanism helped to maintain social stability by providing an outlet for the population's accumulated stress and resentment. The most disturbing aspect of medieval torture psychology was how it transformed ordinary people into enthusiastic participants in systematic cruelty. Historical records show that crowds would cheer, place bets, and even request specific tortures, revealing how quickly normal human empathy could be suspended when cruelty was given official sanction. This psychological transformation demonstrates the frightening malleability of human moral reasoning when subjected to authoritarian pressure and social conformity. Closing. As we emerge from this journey into humanity's darkest chapter, we're left with questions that challenge our fundamental understanding of human nature itself. These weren't isolated acts of madness or the products of primitive ignorance, but systematic, legally sanctioned procedures carried out by educated, religious people who believed they were serving justice and God. The 5 punishments we've explored represent more than historical curiosities or medieval barbarism. They reveal the terrifying capacity for cruelty that lies dormant within human civilization, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of authority, ideology, and social pressure. What should disturb us most isn't that these tortures existed, but how Azeli entire societies embraced them as normal, necessary, and even virtuous. The medieval period ended over 500 years ago, yet the psychological mechanisms that enabled these atrocities remain embedded in human nature. History has repeatedly shown us that ordinary people can become willing participants in extraordinary cruelty when given official permission, ideological justification. The Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and countless other modern atrocities prove that the capacity for systematic brutality didn't disappear with the Middle Ages. It simply evolved, finding new expressions in each generation. Today's world, with its emphasis on human rights and individual dignity, represents a fragile achievement that required centuries of moral evolution to develop. The legal protections we take for granted, the concept of cruel and unusual punishment, and even our basic understanding of human empathy are recent innovations in the grand scope of human history. These medieval punishments serve as a stark reminder of how quickly civilized society can collapse when fear, hatred, and authoritarianism are allowed to flourish unchecked. The crowds who cheered at public executions weren't fundamentally different from us. They were human beings with the same capacity for love, compassion, and moral reasoning that we possess today. Yet they were shaped by a culture that normalized extreme violence and taught them to find entertainment in human suffering. This historical reality should humble us and make us vigilant about protecting the moral progress our species has achieved. The distance between medieval torture chambers and modern civilization is measured in years, but in the strength of our institutions, the depth of our empathy, and our commitment to human dignity. These safeguards are more fragile than we like to believe. As we face modern challenges of political polarization, social media manipulation, and the erosion of democratic norms, we must remember the lessons these medieval horrors teach us. Cruelty doesn't announce itself with fanfare or obvious evil. It creeps in gradually, disguised as justice, necessity, or divine will. It convinces good people to do terrible things by making those things seem reasonable, even the true horror of medieval punishment wasn't the physical agony inflicted on victims, but the moral blindness that allowed entire civilizations to participate in systematic cruelty while believing they were doing good. That same moral blindness threatens every generation, including our own. The price of human dignity is eternal vigilance against the forces that would strip it away, one compromise at a time.